This conference will now be recorded.
Matt, I'm ready when you are.
Yeah, let's wait another minute because people are still arriving and it's beeping every 20 seconds.
Still stopping.
Yeah. So we've got 51 people now. All right, so it's become a bit quiet. So not quite. Okay, so it's actually getting to 5 minutes past, so perhaps we should start. So hi everybody, welcome to this edition of OpenID Foundation Workshop. We're at an important juncture. This March, we have published the first specification of Fappy version 1.0. It's the first final specification in 10 years, but it doesn't end there. We have a series of specifications to follow it, starting from CIBA Core 1.0. The management team also has a change. Don Thibault, who's been leading the OpenID Foundation for over a decade, is changing his role, and we are welcoming the new executive director, Gail Hodges. She's going to arrive at this workshop later today and will have her first address. However, Don is not going away. He's assuming a new role of non-executive director and will keep working with us, advancing the identity space to a new phase. So, Don, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Ned. First and foremost, I want to thank you for your leadership and your friendship for these many years. It's been a great honor and privilege. I also wanted to point out the work of Mike Les, who has been just a stalwart in managing the OpenID Foundation's work that Mike makes it look easy, but it ain't. And lastly, thank all of you, the members who've been so much fun to hang out with over these many years. So back to the notion of the workshop today and what we'll be doing for the next few hours. There's really three things that happen. For those of you that are new to the format, this is, as Nat mentioned, a meeting that occurs only twice a year. And it allows you to do three things. One, to do some speed dating, to hear from other work groups what interesting work they're doing, what the state of their standards are, etc. It also gives you a chance to hear how work in other work groups may impact the work that you're doing or that others may as well. So we're looking deliberately for that kind of read across work groups. The second thing is that we often use this as an occasion to share some special news or take a close look at a couple of special issues. And today we've got two of those. One is a real deep dive into one of the most important identity systems challenges, certainly in the US, and that is the kind of the reshaping of the healthcare ecosystem from a technical standards point of view. We're going to hear about that from Ryan Howells of the CARIN Alliance. And also with some sense of urgency as well, we're going to be hearing about the latest in a series of conversations with our colleagues from Google about a set of changes with regard to their new cookie policy. So yeah, a read across among all the work groups, a chance to hear on a deep dive on a couple of important issues. And the last thing that we usually do at these kind of meetings is have a beer and gossip. So we won't be able to do that, but we'll have a little bit of gossip towards the end. And I see that Mike Jones or Mike Les has appropriately put up our read ahead. So I'll give you a moment to look at that. Note that it's been displayed. And Nat, I'm going to turn the agenda back to you.
Thanks, Don. So what was briefly displayed was a note wall. I have also put the link to the chat window so you can read it carefully. It's basically saying that what you're going to be saying here could be used as a comment by the foundation to perhaps improve our products as well, and so on and so forth. Real legal thing is don't take my word, just read the sentences here. And I'll give you a minute for that before turning back to the agenda. All right. So, Mike, could you kindly put back the agenda, please? Thank you. So, first agenda item for today is, well, actually, let me just say, the agenda for today is really, really packed. We've got 15 minutes presentations from each working group and sub-working group. And by going through them, you will have pretty good idea of what is happening at the OpenID Foundation. And maybe some of you who might have not joined the working group up until now may want to consider joining some of them. So without further ado, let's start with the first agenda item, which is self-issued OpenID provider SIOP update, collaborating with Decentralized Identity Foundation. Christina, it's your stage.
Thank you, Nat. Can you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Can you hear me okay?
Fine.
Awesome, great. I'm super excited to present the progress we've made on the self-issued OpenID provider work item. And so this has been done in the Connect working group, and also we have been having SIOP special calls previously bi-weekly and starting from next week, weekly. And this has been part of the liaison relationships that OpenID Foundation has established with Decentralized Identity Foundation, and sort of with overarching higher goal to build a bridge between decentralized identity and the OpenID Connect. So there have been 3 work streams under our working group. So one is self-issued OpenID provider, aka SIOP v2. And out of this item, we decided to recently spin out a separate work item, which is how can we use OpenID Connect to present verifiable credentials as defined in the Diversity C specification. And when we were talking about presentation, the conversation on, well, can we use OpenID Connect to issue verifiable credentials came up, and that led to sort of discussing the issuance, but at a higher level that touches upon how can you ask for claims to be issued in a client-bound manner, and also be issued from, how can a relying party ask an OP to receive sendbacks of claims issued from several claims providers. And so one big message I wanted to deliver in this presentation was, when we talk about the buildings as bridge, it is really about these three work items, and SIOP does not mean all three together, right? SIOP means a particular model where each user controls their own OP, contrary to where thousands, millions of users potentially use one identity provider. And yeah, this was just a confusion I have heard sometimes, so just wanted to clarify that SIOP means a very specific thing when we talk about it. And in the end, I'm also planning to touch upon the use cases, the why do we even consider for users to have their own OPs, and, merging a very solid Connect space with this emerging verifiable credential space, right? So in the previous presentation, in the previous workshop, I have already introduced the idea of self-issued OpenID provider, which is already defined in Chapter 7 of the Connect core, and refers to a very specific model, which I just described, where users control their own OPs. And that has been raised a lot of different issues, because first of all, it is a different trust model where how does the relying party know how to trust a self-issued OPs where potentially there are as many of them as the number of users? And the current proposal has been, and because when SIOP is sitting on the user's device, you cannot really do dynamic client registration. The current proposal has been to do an ad hoc registration where a relying party negotiates the registration metadata alongside the request. And this also means that because self-issued OP, even if it's sitting on the user's device or controlled by the user, it still means users using some kind of provider, some kind of software, right? So does that mean, how can we communicate that sort of attestation information has been another issue. And of course, there's a consent change. There are other very interesting topics, and I wanted to deep dive on two of those. So one is, so we have in the space, we have seen, so there are several implementations in the space already, and we have seen that led to sort of several self-issued OPs potentially sitting on the user's device or in the user's browser, if it's a browser wallet. And the question is, how does the relying party know which wallet it's supposed to talk to get a particular claim? And one option has been what we call SIOP chooser, which is a combination of the list of the wallets, which is potentially maintained by Trust Framework, one for financial industry, one for healthcare industry potentially, and then using universal links to open that self-issued OP from the browser, which potentially sits on the device or the browser, and using the share sheets to choose between several wallets under the user's control. And it feels sort of kind of a hack, but the working group seems to agree that it seems to be a current best solution that will work with different kinds of wallets, not just native apps, but also browser wallets. And it's not ideal, but without OS vendors collaborations, this seems to be the most viable solution. And of course, the second option is what's currently in the specification, to use the custom URL schema, where each relying party would have to somehow get the custom URL of each self-issued OP beforehand, which could lead to an escrow problem, but would work nevertheless. And another issue, I think I quickly introduced this in the last workshop too, but now the user needs to prove control over the self-issued OP that it controls, right? And the current Chapter 7 defines the user duplicate thumbprint, but DID's decentralized identifiers are another mechanism to do that. And the ID token would be signed by the keys, which the relying party can find inside the DID document that they can retrieve from the DIDs. And that was the first work stream, right? And we spin out the separate working item. How can we request and present verifiable credentials using any Connect flow, not just SIOP, but also code flow or CBA and whatnot? And how can we leverage these verifiable credentials in existing Connect deployments as a goal? And as a request, the current proposal is to use claims parameter. The verifiable credentials have a particular field called type, which identifies credential type, and you can specify the claims parameter in the request which type you're asking for. And if you want the selector disclosure, you can specify which claims inside that type you're asking for. And recently, there have been several options, more than 2. The working group has dropped one of those, and currently there's a draft being worked on how to embed. It allows for both options, embedding entire verifiable presentations inside the ID token, or returning verifiable presentations as a separate artifact alongside ID token from the authorization endpoint. And verifiable presentations potentially using the same syntax for both options, embedding and as a separate artifact. And also there have been ideas to potentially return from the user info endpoint or define a new endpoint, but that's up to the discussion. So if you have strong opinions, very welcome. And I wanted to call out Torsten, Oliver, Adam, and Tobias for the great work and contribution for this work item. And just to give you a quick idea, I know we're short of time, so I'll probably skip this, but this would be the request and embedding entire verifiable presentation expressed in a JOT format inside the ID token. So these are the usual parameters of ID token. And verifiable presentations can have several formats, not just a JOT, but also linked data proofs. So ideally, we would want to allow linked data proofs signed verifiable presentations to be embedded inside the ID token a similar way. And a separate artifact VP token so this would be an ID token, which would potentially have a VP hash to bind that particular ID token to a verifiable presentation, and verifiable presentation would be entirely separate item returned alongside the ID token. So that was the second working item. And lastly, I want to touch upon the issuance of aggregated / client-bound claims from the claims provider. And so the scope is to specify the methods for an application to perform a discovery of the claims provider, registers a client, obtains the claims, and returns them. So this sounds a bit, who's who, and this is the great picture that I borrowed from that, where he was explaining why this is needed. And OpenID Connect currently has 3 claims model. So one, which is, I don't know if you can see my arrow, probably not. So one is simply when relying party asking for the claims that OP already has. And aggregated claims is where OP is going to another sources, claims providers, potentially not just 1, but 2, to get different claims and returns them to the relying party, which complicates a little bit the picture, because now this OP, which is C, is acting as a relying party to different claims providers. So how can we deal with that? And the current Connect core specification does not provide the binding information between the subject field of these claims providers and of these OpenID provider, and there's no specified method to downscope the user info of the claims provider. So there are several things to figure out. And there's a working group adopted claims aggregation draft, and their issues being filed in. And yeah, I forgot to mention the previous self-issued SIOP v2 draft is also the working group adopted. And for this claim segregation, there's it is to be merged with another draft, which is to be contributed. And so what the draft essentially does, if the left side is the normal code flow, it defines a new claims endpoint which belongs to the claims provider, from which using the access token, the relying party can get claims, aggregated claims or verifiable credentials to send back to the initial client. So this is a bit more holistic picture, but yeah, I can speak to it later, but I think it's too much complication for here. So those were separate 3 work items we have been discussing in the use cases, right? So what problems does allowing users to have their own OPs and users being able to receive and present verifiable presentations, what problem does it solve that the current Connect flows does not really solve? So first, what comes to mind first is privacy preservation, where if the user can directly present the claims without issuer call home or relying party have to talk to the third party, which is not the user, it could be more privacy preserved flow. And this in particular has been considered in the mobile driving license specification in ISO 18013-5. And also, so I mentioned there are several existing deployments, and I took these sort of examples from there. Another is addressing issuer cease to exist use case, where university issues student cards for their alumni, and alumni can keep using those regardless of university existence, and also potentially it's less costs for the university because it doesn't have to keep third-party providers to maintain these alumni records in the registry. And finally, the claims aggregation, and also the verifiability aspect and the real-time status check, which NHS is using to verify whether the doctors is eligible to perform the duties. And apparently in the UK, they ask is for the doctors to prove their eligibility every month. And now they have to go take days off, go obtain the certificate that they're still eligible, presented, and simplifying that in digital format has been saving a lot of time. Another use cases that have been mentioned include remote onboarding, getting sort of higher assurance app access, and using self-service recovery, because if user already possesses a verifiable credential that does not depend on any other third party and it lost access to via YubiKey, for example, it can present a VC to obtain the recovery to do the recovery. But we are looking for more use cases, for more deployments, where to use. So yeah, this has been a very interesting space of 2 different communities coming together, sharing knowledge of why VCs have been created, why DIDs are considered to be useful, and what sort of edge cases or what are the use cases that Connect doesn't cover, even though it covers all the use cases, obviously. So that has been a really interesting journey, which just began, as I suppose. So now, as I mentioned, we're having weekly special calls, and they're alternating between Pacific and Atlantic, more Europe-friendly time zones, and these issues are also touched upon in the Connect working group calls. Like, not always, because there are other work items too, obviously, but you can, if you come to Connect calls, you can also ask about the SIOP calls too. So yeah, this is the progress we've made on SIOP, and I want to join in thanking Dawn for the great service, and Mike, and thank you for accommodating the time zone issues so I can present while I'm still awake. So yeah.
Thanks for staying up late.
All right, thanks very much, Christina. It's actually 1:30 a.m. in Tokyo, where we are. And thanks for, staying up so late. So, unfortunately, we don't have time to take questions, but maybe if you guys have something, you can type it in chat. We have Q&A sessions at the very end. So you could do that as well there. So thanks very much again, Christina.
Yeah, just one last thing, sorry. We also have Oliver Turber from Consensus Mesh, who is an active member at Diff, joining this call. So if you have any particular VC, DID, decentralized SSI related questions, I'm sure he'll be happy to answer. That's all. Sorry, Nat.
No problem. That's great. Thanks very much. And next, coming up next is Fappy Working Group update by Dave Tong, the Fappy Working Group co-chair. So it's your floor, Dave.
Thanks. Yeah, just checking. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, very well. And you look handsome.
It's sunny here still, so yeah, a bit earlier than for you. So yes, just to give a quick update on the Fappy Working Group, which, yeah, just a reminder, is actually the financial grade API working group. We used to be just financial API, but it's now financial grade API working group. What I wanted to go through is just to go through some of the status of the different drafts that we're working on, and talk a little bit about why we're working on these drafts in the working group. So first of all, as Nat mentioned earlier, Fappy 1 has gone to final specification about a month ago or so, and so that's really great. We're actually working on Fappy 2.0. And I just wanted to touch briefly on naming, and obviously it's one of the hardest things in computer science. But yes, essentially just the brief history is that Fappy started off being kind of an all-inclusive suite of standards for a security profile and sort of API profiles and schemas for financial data access. Over time, actually, the scope reduced to exclude all the data and sort of the functional APIs, and to focus purely on the security profile. Initially, it was we had these different parts which were representing that, and part 1 was what was called the read-only profile, and part 2 was the read-write profile. Over time, we realized actually that yes, okay, from a financial point of view, potentially write access, so initiating payments, is more sensitive than read, but there are other environments where read is just as sensitive, for example, in health. So we've moved away from the read and read-write and just to baseline and advanced in terms of different profiles. And essentially, we've moved on to working on version 2.0 of the specs. And so I'll go through a little bit when I get to that, why we're doing that and what's in 2.0. But let's just start with the actual kind of current state of things. So we have 2 specifications which are at final, and so this has been over many years of work by the group. So I want to definitely shout out to all the working group members and co-chairs and contributors. It's been quite a large effort to get there. Already before they were at final specification, the specifications were being used internationally by some quite big deployments, most notably by the open banking ecosystem in the UK. And just again, a little reminder, so that they're based on OpenID Connect and OAuth2, but they're not really identity protocols in that sense. We were using OpenID Connect mainly for the security benefits, so using the ID token as a detached signature and the authorization response, and taking advantage of some of the other kind of security benefits that OIDC brings over vanilla OAuth2. The other main thing that they are really is a bit of a checklist approach, whereby kind of each, rather than having quite descriptive prose and long paragraphs for sort of each part of the flow, there are simple bullet points which mainly refer out to existing specifications. So it's very much, whether you want to call it a subset or a superset, but it's a very constrained implementation of OAuth 2, which really reduces the optionality to focus on sort of more secure deployments. And so that we found the checklist-based approach has been helpful for implementers, but more importantly, has been helpful in developing a really exhaustive suite of conformance tests. And yeah, I need to do a big shout out to Joseph Heenan and the rest of the team working on the conformance tests. That's been a really important part of the specifications. Well, as part of the working group outputs, really, that we have these exhaustive conformance test suites, and certain regulators in different environments are actually now mandating. So where there is legal requirements for organizations to provide APIs, for example, in Europe with PSD2 or in Australia with the CDR, sometimes the regulators are now requiring data providers to conform to the Fappy standards and to actually publish their conformance status. So yeah, that's been quite an active part of the profile, and actually it's been quite useful. We get feedback quite regularly from those conformance tests, which can help us kind of really clarify the specifications as well. So yes, moving on now to, we have some other implementers drafts. And so we have the Fappy CIBA profile, which is a very lightweight profile on top of CIBA Core, which is from the Moderna working group. But we did sort of push a lot of that work from the Fappy working group because there was a requirement to enable decoupled, so-called decoupled authorization flows. So this is currently an implementers draft. Hopefully we'll move through to final soon, along with CIBA Core. We also have JARM, so the JOT Secured Authorization Response Mode for OAuth 2. And as I mentioned, Fappy itself is a it's an OAuth 2 security profile, which borrows many of the security characteristics from OIDC. However, we had some implementers who wanted the benefits of this, but wanted to have it separate from OIDC, especially to maybe leave OIDC for anything identity related. And so as part of that, in the working group, we worked on, and mainly shouts out to Torsten on this, on the JARM specification, which enables signed responses from the authorization endpoint, which was one of the main benefits we got from OIDC. So those are in implementers draft. We are about to go into the public review phase very nearly. We're just finalizing the HTML artifacts for Fappy 2.0, both the baseline security profile and the attacker model. And so just briefly touching on this, Fappy 2.0 takes quite a lot of the learnings we've had from the experience with Fappy 1.0, and it has an increased scope in the sense that we're aiming for kind of complete interoperability between the client and the authorization server. And so what I mean by that is we are leaning on other work, which I'll touch on in a minute, on things like PAR and RAR, to really, where we've seen Fappy being used currently, different jurisdictions have had to put their own additional work on top of Fappy to have an end-to-end solution. And so with Fappy 2, we're trying to actually accommodate all of that work, which is mainly around things like rich authorization requests, where a lot of the flows that use Fappy are not simple scope-based authorization flows, but sometimes there's complex payment information, etc. But the other thing we're trying to do with Fappy 2.0, and a big shout out to Daniel Fett for leading this, is having a really well-defined attacker model. We did have an attacker model for Fappy 1.0, but it wasn't formally documented. It's kind of spread across various security considerations and issue tracker and pros in the text. Whereas with Fappy 2.0, we have a very clearly defined attacker model, which will be useful for hopefully when we move to some more formal analysis of the specification. But one of the things it's enabled us to do is to actually meet the same security characteristics as Fappy 1, but actually without the need for lots of signatures. So through using things like PAR, the pushed authorization request, we can avoid quite a lot of the need for signatures with request objects or ID tokens. We can protect actually just with PAR and PIXI and things like that. So it can reduce down some of the complexity of implementing these profiles. I'll move quickly on, and I'm taking time. So we also have a few other working group drafts as well. And so these are in earlier stages. So we have the advanced security profile, which is from Fappy 2.0, which the main benefit that brings is adding in non-repudiation for all message exchanges. So that does bring signatures back into the specification. And as part of that, we have a working group draft on simple HTTP message integrity protocol. So we have that, and that's still kind of an early stage, but looking around, you know, a standard around kind of HTTP signatures, but borrowing very heavily from Depop. We're still not sure where we'll go with that in the working group draft. There's lots of other work happening around HTTP signing in the standards ecosystem at the moment, but we do need something for Fappy 2.0 advanced. There's quite a lot of working group effort at the moment, though, on grant management. And so Dima and Stuart and Torsten are leading on this. And that's come partly out of some of the requirements we've seen in Australia with the CDR. And so that is, again, just where there are requirements for concurrent grants. So, you know, in some jurisdictions, you can have a very simple one end user to one client to one authorization server, just one grant. Whereas actually, if you can have concurrent grants, then you sometimes need a way to manage those and to signal that the client might want to signal, please, when I'm sending this user back, can you update this grant? Or actually, no, I need a brand new grant. And so this specification aims to allow those sorts of use cases. So that's currently a working group draft, but we'll likely move to an implementers draft quite soon. Because we're getting quite a lot of feedback that it'll be useful. And yeah, just to call out in closing, really, although these are not being worked on directly in the working group, these specifications have been worked on by working group members, and they're all at different stages, but all quite influenced by the work happening in the Fappy working group. So there's RFC 8705, which is the OAuth mutual TLS. I mean, that's an RFC already. OAuth JAR, which is very, very, very nearly an RFC, obviously predated a lot of the Fappy work, but we reference it in Fappy. The ones which may be a little bit more relevant is OAuth PAR and OAuth RAR, which I very strongly encourage you to look at. OAuth PAR was definitely influenced by some earlier versions of the Fappy 1.0 spec. And yeah, allows all the authorization request data, whether that's scopes or rich metadata and redirect URIs, all to be passed to a backend endpoint and to get back just a request URI in order to minimize the information that needs to be sent over the front channel. So very, very useful. So although that work is happening in the IETF OAuth working group, a lot of the Fappy working group members are involved with it. And yes, there are a few other ones there as well. So yeah, thank you very much for listening in. Very happy to take any questions in the chat. And yeah, hopefully we will be moving forward with Fappy 2.0 at quite an advanced pace.
Thanks very much, Dave. So that was a very, very full briefing of the Fappy working group status in a very short time. So thanks very much. All right, so again, you guys can post questions in chat window or wait until the end of this or the workshop to post the questions. Next coming up is eKYC and IDA working group led by Mark Hain. Mark, it's your floor. And
thank you, Nat, and to everybody else for having me speak today. I think we're a little behind schedule, so I'll try and be brief. but really this is just a kind of introductory and update on the work we've been doing on in the eKYC and Identity Assurance Working Group in recent months. So, oh, why is that not moving forward? Sorry, I'll just, how do I make that go away? I'll just put it over there. So I've got a very brief agenda here. I wanted to give you a kind of status update, highlight some of the things that we are advancing with at the moment. The work we're advancing at the moment is going into Implementers Draft 3, and then a little bit of a look ahead to see what we have in mind for our next steps after Implementers Draft 3. I also wanted to highlight where we rely on other members of the OpenID Foundation for various aspects of what we're doing. And finally, to highlight some projects and implementations that we're aware of or supporting as part of our working group activities. So first of all, I wanted to say hopefully there is some familiarity with OpenID for Identity Assurance, which is our core draft. It's essentially a representation of verified claims and the verification metadata that go along with those. And on the next slide, I've got a little a snippet of a response just to kind of bring that to life for people. The current focus is on that OpenID for Identity Assurance draft and focusing on Implementers Draft 3 before too long. We've been pushing forward issues which are getting rolled into that draft as hard as we can in recent weeks. We are splitting out some topics into separate drafts, and this is kind of a work in progress. Probably the most mature at this stage of those other drafts is OpenID for Authority, which was driven by the question, how do we handle legal entity use cases? But has really become more of a authority to act on some other entity's part, whether that is a legal entity or another natural person. There's some question we've been working on around more deterministic behavior relating to abort and Unmet, and we don't have a name for that draft yet or that separate document. And similarly, some questions about how to handle whether there was a match or whether there was some data that was unavailable. And in order to push forwards the kind of core elements of OpenID for Identity Assurance, we've decided to pull those out into separate documents. I'd also do want to highlight that we have a real strong interest in the topic of conditional claims, and that has been handed in the direction of the AB Connect working group, but we need to move that forward, particularly for the use cases that we're interested in. It is something that implementers in the real world are asking for, and we're keen to deliver that in the context of verified claims and the verification metadata. Here is the core of a response. This one would be what you would see coming back from a user info endpoint. And I don't know, where's the, there we go. It builds. And really it's just to highlight that we have the verified claims container, which in turn contains the verification data. And this is essentially metadata about how the verified end user claims were in fact verified. So we've got things like descriptions of the type of document or card that was used, when it happened, transaction IDs, various useful things there to effectively enrich the understanding of the relying party about how these claims were collected, when they were collected, how they were collected. I'm not going to go into a great deal more detail on that at this stage. It was just to kind of bring it into people's consciousness at this stage. So the topics that we are advancing before delivering Implementers Draft 3, there's a number here, and some of them are quite obscure topics, but attaching evidence documents, there are a number of cases when dealing with identity verification where the relying party wants to actually see the evidence document. You know, a driving license or a utility bill, the actual bitmap. So there's some work going in to describe that, and proposals being embedded into the draft. There's more work being done to define how claims are returned when some of them or all of them are not available, and we're actually adding some detail into the spec to allow a relying party to have some control over whether claims are returned if some conditions are not met. There's a number of refinements to the privacy considerations going in, so really guidance for implementers on what they should be doing. There's a particular thing that we had was the trust framework attribute in the specification actually previously contained reference to the trust framework and the level of assurance, and after thinking about it, we decided to separate those two concerns. So there's a separate attribute being added about the identity assurance level. And there are a huge number of clarifications and editorial issues, and I would like to particularly call out to Kai Lehman, who has been doing a great job of picking out all those little issues in wording and pushing a whole load of PRs through the working group. My slide isn't advancing. There we are. So after we push Implementers Draft 3 out for review, which I'm personally kind of hoping we do in the next month or so, we will be continuing work on OpenID for Authority, which I mentioned earlier. We are going to be, I think, working out how to move conditional claims forward in partnership with the AB Connect working group. There's a chunk of work which we're going to be doing in conjunction with the conformance testing team to allow conformance testing of the eKYC extensions to OpenID Connect as well. There's some clarification of the claims request parameters, something that we spotted in a couple of hypothetical client implementations that is just not terribly clear in OpenID Core and the discovery specs. And finally, there's an outstanding question of how some long-running processes may be handled and represented. You know, sometimes identity verification takes time, and from a relying party perspective, they don't know whether the end user in question has been properly verified or not. And so it feels like there's a use case there for having a pending state in some relation to the verified claims. But again, it's a question at the moment rather than any really clear direction. We have worked on a roadmap for eKYC and IDA, and I just thought it would be interesting for everybody to kind of see that as well. So down the middle here, we've got the kind of the main effort for delivering OpenID for identity assurance. We've got Implementers Draft finishing sometime soon, and then pushing for a kind of final spec of or a final draft of that towards the end of the year, maybe. We've got the authority claims piece going on in parallel as a separate document. We have ongoing work developing use cases and writing examples of requests and responses in the schema as defined by the identity assurance draft. We've got interest in age verification and conditional claims, and that is a topic we've already done quite a lot of work on, and you know, passed over some responsibility to the AB Connect working group because I think it's quite probably something that should be done at a, you know, an OpenID level rather than as part of eKYC and IDA ultimately. We've got the conformance testing piece, which has been under discussion, and we're kind of optimistic that that's going to go into its first phase of development with Joseph and the team in, well, next month, hopefully. We've got a number of industry collaborations going on, which I'll call out towards the end of the presentation. And I just highlight that there are production implementations of various natures in existence of this draft as well. So where we fit in with other parts of the OpenID Foundation kind of structure, there's quite a strong dependency, we believe, on the Fappy drafts. When we're dealing with identity data and verified identity data, which is obviously sensitive, and we are strongly encouraging in the wording of our draft that the financial grade API should be the starting point from a kind of security profile perspective. But there's no point in reinventing that. We're just saying that's what should be done. I've mentioned a couple of times already. Actually, no, this one's slightly different. There is a little lack of clarity on the claims request parameter specification in OpenID Core that we're going to be discussing with AB Connect very shortly. There's a relationship with Joseph and the conformance team, and there's interoperability with verified claims. It's something that certainly I get asked about when presenting about eKYC and IDA, the question of how does it fit with EC. That's something Torsten, I think, is probably the most equipped to deal with at this stage, and he's promising to bring me up to speed on that topic as well. As far as what exists out there by way of real implementations, we've got a number of vendors out there who have, our vendors and organizations who have implemented the draft spec as is. I'll just call out to Authleet, Denic in Germany, Connect2ID, and the open sourced Identity First effort as well. So that's fantastic. And from a kind of real world implementations that are running today, there's yes.com and Denic again. Finally, we've got a number of collaborations going on between the working group and external parties. So the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan is working with our Japanese representatives in the working group, and through them they pass challenging little questions to the group to deal with. They are particularly focused on the legal entity use case, so there's quite a good parallel stream of work going on between METI and OpenID for Authority, in conjunction with the other elements of ID assurance. Open Banking at the start of this year ran a project called Extended Customer Attributes, funded by 7 of the UK banks, and there was a unanimous agreement to use OpenID for identity assurance as the baseline for a project where those banks collaborate on delivering digital ID for the UK environment. There's another UK project here, the Investing and Savings Alliance, again working on a scheme for providing identity attributes in a kind of more savings context in the UK. One of the things that's maybe worth just calling out specifically in the schema for OpenID for IDA is the trust framework attribute, and we have a relationship with the OIX. Who are working hard on defining what's required in a good trust framework, and we feel that's really complementary to what we're doing, and providing the link between the technology element, the OpenID for IDA spec, and the policy elements provided by the trust framework aspects in OIX is really great. A recent new joiner to the working group is an organization called GRIDS. A couple of gentlemen joined us to help each other develop an implementation in Europe, and they're working on EID for business. Again, it's one that's for legal entity use cases. And finally, obviously, yes.com are a key contributor to OpenID for IDEA, amongst other things, you know, donating the spec originally, or the draft spec originally, and offering funding for conformance alongside, I think it was Connect to ID as well. So we have some funding for the development work that needs to go ahead. And I think that's my last slide. So I look forward to questions and discussion in the chat. But that's me.
Thank you very much, Mark. So that was a great presentation.
Thank you, Nat.
Yeah, you just made some time for us. I'm caught up some. That's great. So if you guys have any questions, please ask in the chat window. Next coming up is OpenID certification program update. Mark just touched on it a little bit. It's one of the core program that OpenID Foundation is operating. Joseph Heenan is the leader of the team, and it's your floor, Joseph.
Right. Thank you, Nat, and thank you everyone that's already name dropped the certification team in their presentations. Very nice to hear. So I'm Joseph Heenan. I'm the technical lead for the OpenID Foundation certification program. So the certification program is designed to be a lightweight, low-cost certification program to serve our members. It's been running for 6 years now, initially launching for identity providers, then for relying parties later, and for financial grade API 2 years ago now. The certification is really about making sure that all the implementations out there are good implementations and that they work together and that they're as secure as we can hopefully make them. The list of certified implementation is published on the OpenID website. And we've got a large number of certifications, so 616 certifications to date of 200 deployments, and there's more added every month. See, the OP program has been going the longest, so that has the most certifications, but the number of Fappy certifications is ticking up fairly rapidly now. And Fappy CIBA is also starting to get a bit of attention. So the UK very much led the way with adopting Fappy and certifying Fappy under the direction of their open banking implementation entity. They actually sponsored all the initial development of the Fappy certification suite and donated it to the OpenID Foundation. So currently 15 UK banks that are certified. Most of the CMA 9, the largest 9 banks have certified, and the other ones are in progress. And OBIE is requiring the largest 9 banks to recertify annually to make sure they are staying in conformance. We're seeing lots of traction in other jurisdictions as well. So we're expecting FDX in the US to formally announce their adoption of Fappy and Fappy certification imminently. We're working quite closely with the Australian team who have adopted Fappy as their standard, and we're doing some workshops over there to help people understand how to Fappy certify in Australia. Brazil is a kind of relatively recent addition. They've adopted Fappy. They're working with the OpenID Foundation again to do a series of workshops, and they're looking to mandate Fappy certification for both banks and relying parties. And we're working in various other jurisdictions as well. In terms of why you should use the OpenID conformance program, we work quite closely with the relevant working groups, updating the tests based on requests from the working group and feeding back to the working group tests we're implementing and asking for feedback. passing feedback on the specs as well. The testers using the certification suite get direct support from the certification team, going straight to the knowledgeable people. There's no kind of first level support desks here. So we're all domain experts, we're familiar with the specs, and we've got kind of direct access to all the underlying spec authors as well, who are very helpful when we've got questions. The program's won a number of awards, and as I say, we're getting recognition from many of the regulators internationally now. The tests are obviously all maintained by us, so when new versions of the specifications are published, we update the tests. If there's potential secure vulnerabilities found, then we add tests that check for those when necessary. So we had an example of one of those in the last year where we've added an extra test to make sure that the request objects that clients are generating aren't usable as private key JWT client assertions, and vice versa. And obviously we get a lot of feedback from the field as well, so any interoperability problems that come up, we try and add new tests to make sure that they don't occur again with any luck. So the Fappy program itself, it's because it was initially started by Open Banking, it's actually got almost coming up for 4 years under its hat now. And we've added tests for the newer versions of Fappy as it's supported, adding RP tests, and then adding tests for the Fappy CEBA specification that Dave mentioned earlier as well, which is the decoupled authentication method. And obviously the test optionally supports things that are necessary in particular jurisdictions to actually be able to run the test. So it supports the Open Banking Pacific, UK Pacific intent lodging. There's various Pacific Australia mechanisms. So I'll not cover this in detail as Dave mentioned this earlier, but the Fappy specs have been renamed, so that may cause a little bit of confusion in the test harness in the short term, as we've got both Fappy read-write implementers draft 2 specs tests, and we also have, or we'll shortly have, tests for Fappy 1 advanced final, which are obviously almost the same tests, as there's very few normative changes between the 2 versions of the spec, but they will both be there. So we added tests for pushed authentication requests, which is an IETF standard. I think it's actually just gone to the RFC editor, so my slide needs updating. So that's an optional part of Fappy, and one that Australia plan to adopt. So we've already got support for that ready to go, and we've already got a few certifications under our belt. And again, Australian CDR, they've already got a couple of banks live. We've got a couple certified. The slide covers the Australian Pacific bits, the suite tests. And we're looking at doing RP tests at some point for Australia as well. That's still under discussion. So Brazil is the new kid on the block. They're using Fappy 1 Advanced straight off, which as Nat mentioned was finalized just last month. The final version was published. There's 40 banks due to be live and certified by July. Again, that they have some specific bits, some specific restrictions that we'll need to support in the conformance suite, and we're talking with them about developing the Brazil Pacific versions of the tests. Short on time, so I'm going to skip through a little bit. So basically, everybody should be running these tests if you're in the Fappy world. It reduces your support costs. It means things are interoperable. and anyone can test your server, and it's kind of embarrassing if other people run the conformance suite against your server and you end up failing, especially if you've told the government regulator you comply with the specs. And just some quick notes on actually testing. We see a non-zero number of people that come and try to Fappy certify that don't actually support the Fappy specs, so that actually supporting the Fappy specs is really a important pre-step to trying to certify. Ideally, you'd use a Fappy certified version of your vendor's product. And if you don't, you're going to find that bits are missing. The most common one that we see some vendors still being missing is MTLS sender constrained access tokens, which prevents stolen access tokens being used by attackers. And I think particularly for banks, you just need to be careful that you don't have any old HSMs that only support flawed versions of PKCS. And there's some pre-testing steps that often confuse people or trip them up a bit. You do need 2 registered OAuth clients to run the Fappy tests. That's because some of the tests we do are the security checks that make sure that one client can't use another client's authorization code or refresh token. So we need 2 valid clients to do it. So whoever's running the test really needs to be able to create and register client credentials, or have someone that knows what they're doing provide them in the correct format. And it's really recommended that the tester has existing domain knowledge of all this stuff. So just throwing it over the wall to a generic tester to run isn't usually going to go very well. Get the first run them by one of your developers or the person actually configuring the vendor solution or something like that that does have a good understanding of what's going on. And this is basically my final slide. So the conformance suite is all open source. It's on GitLab. Everything's open. You can run it locally. There's a version in the cloud that the URL's for here. Anybody can just log into that using any Google or GitLab or OpenID account. There's no need to register or any difficult steps in the way of you running it. The instructions are all on the OpenID website, and feel free to get in touch if you want any help. And that's me. So thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Joseph, for thorough description of certification. Again, if you guys are interested in asking questions, please use the chat window. Right, next up is OpenID Foundation and the CARIN Alliance, enabling the digital identity infrastructure for US healthcare. So Ryan from the CARIN Alliance is kindly giving us a presentation on this topic. Ryan, it's your floor. And Don, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just a few words of introduction. I mentioned at the beginning of the workshop that we try and keep an eye on implementers and people that have to make things work in the challenging environments that we're talking about, both from a technical point of view as well as an operational one. And I think here's a great example of using OpenID Connect and other OpenID Foundation standards at scale under a pretty tight timeline in an enormously challenging environment called US healthcare. So first of all, my compliments to Ryan for leading the effort. I think it's a great example of really looking across the standards community for help wherever he could find it. And the OpenID Foundation is glad to be part of his efforts.
And we're glad to have you, Don and Nat. Good to see you again as well. This is just an honor and a privilege to be here with you. And thank you for the opportunity. As Don mentioned, we're going to focus more on the policy and trust framework side of the house in part of this, not the technology piece, and just give you a sense of where US healthcare is right now in terms of interoperability and data sharing. overall. I work at a company called Levitt Partners, and we help lead and operate the CARIN Alliance, but it takes a village of folks to help do that, many of which are on the phone today and are participating in this. This is the timeline of US healthcare technology in one slide or less. The key things to know here is that as recently as 2010, there was only about roughly 20% of all of the health records digitized in any type of a digital format whatsoever. And so it took about 10 years and about $40 billion to get to a point where we had the healthcare records digitized in the US. And so as a result of that, application programming interfaces were a foreign concept, at least certainly not in the technical world, but essentially across all of healthcare up until the last 3 to 5 years. We have developed a standard with our standards development organization for healthcare internationally called HL7, called the FHIR standard, FHIR, which FHIR APIs are now become the opportunity to send information back and forth between systems like you guys do right now in financial services and obviously every other industry. So we're a little slower, we're a little bigger. It's like the Titanic, but we're moving forward. Hopefully we're not going in that same direction. But our goal now, because there has been 2 regulations passed or written, I should say, in US healthcare, both from the Office of National Coordinator for Health IT, who oversees provider technology for the country, as well as the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, who oversees health plans in the US, that requires APIs, OpenID Connect. It requires OAuth 2, all of the standard technologies that are seen outside of healthcare are now required inside healthcare. So this is very nascent for us. And one of the other reasons that it is so nascent is because we have been used to working in a regulatory space in the US healthcare called HIPAA, which uses more EDI related technologies and other kind of what we call healthcare snowflake-like standards that were unique to US healthcare. And now what we're doing is we're moving regulatory environments in the US healthcare space. We're moving from not only within the HIPAA regulated environment, but also moving to the FTC regulated environment where consumers can gain access to that information using these open API standards through an app of their choice. And this is 100% focused where CARIN's focused. So we have this distinct desire of business to consumer data exchange in the US healthcare system. It's definitely a public-private partnership. We have about 70 plus organizations participating, hundreds of members too. It's a membership-based alliance, but it also is available to anyone that can provide meaningful contributions. Our quarterly meetings are open to anyone. Love to have participation from folks that are smart outside of US healthcare that are on this call. We have big tech involved, Google, Apple, Microsoft. We've also got large payers, large providers also involved in a lot of identity providers too. So this is kind of how we're thinking about things because it's very, as we said, very nascent, but as we think about how do we set up an environment that involves APIs where we have not set it up before anywhere, either on the health plan or the provider side. And we kind of think of it in 4 big categories. One's obviously identity and access management, both for the individual and the organization. 2 is this idea of an API gateway, which are being installed right now. In fact, these API gateways, as of July 1st of this year, will be installed in every major health plan, provider, and hospital system in the US as of July 1st. 3 is application registration. This is a big deal for us because we anticipate having hundreds of different apps that potentially consumer facing, maybe provider facing, that will come in that need to get access to the data. So how do we streamline that process, but as well as ensuring that we protect the data and that they get the data that they need and deserve based on the regulated environment that they're in. And the 3 is and the last one I should say is this consent-based data sharing framework where we've developed what we call the CARIN Code of Conduct, which outlines a set of best practices that the industry has agreed to on how apps that are currently not covered by HIPAA should actually protect the data, which allows enforcement by both the public and the private sector. So we're going to focus just on digital identity and access management today, and talking to you about where we are. We break it down into 5 main categories, not surprising to this group. Identity, are you who you say you are? Authentication, can I securely log in? Trust and federation, consent, and then matching. We have adopted the NIST standards of IL2 and AL2 for both of those. We like what's happening with FIDO. We like what's happening with GLIFE in terms of organizational identity. Trust and federation, obviously, we're using OIDC for that. We also are adapting UDAP.org, which is an open standard within healthcare that uses kind of job-based authentication to ensure trust between certain systems and including third-party apps. And so this is kind of how we operated. And what we did, excuse me, is we first wrote a white paper that was launched last December. You can find it on our website. Everything we do, by the way, all of the final artifacts that we provide, all of them are on our website, CARINalliance.com. And they're also on the Standards Development Organization's website, hl7.org, that you can find them there. But we wrote this white paper to say, look, OpenID was a great participatory in this, and Don was helpful in helping us navigate this, is about how do we start to bring together a federated trust environment in healthcare. And it comes down to really this slide, and I think this is my kind of final slide that I wanted to touch on, which is we see this digital federated identity ecosystem comprising kind of 4 main groups. One is identity providers themselves. These would be, folks that provide these identity credentials today. They'll use OpenID Connect APIs, PKI, for example, maybe even verifiable credentials to establish an individual's identity as an identity provider. They would get certified by third-party organizations, trust framework organizations that do this certification today. We have one in US healthcare called Direct Trust. There's one internationally called Conterra, one in the pharmaceutical industry called Safe Identity. You guys, I'm sure, are familiar with DIAC up in Canada. These are organizations that would actually certify, for the most part, all of them don't do necessarily all of these things, but they would certify that these identity providers are doing what they said that they would do. And often some of them actually also distribute liability between organizations too, so that whether you're an identity provider or you're a relying party, they'll have liability insurance that actually distributes that liability across the board. And then we're establishing equivalency with the work that we're doing with this what's called Digital Federated Trust Agreement that would actually link these trust framework organizations so that there would be equivalency across the trust framework organizations to allow identity providers to go to multiple different certifiers that are connected with this overall Digital Federated Trust Agreement itself. We think this is a model that can scale, to Don's point earlier. We think it's a model that's helpful in multiple industries. We think, again, at its core, it's very simple, but at a more detailed level, it's extraordinarily complicated, and there's a lot of lawyers involved in helping us to make this happen. And so we need to really try to figure out a way to get it right. Don mentioned that the drive, and this is, I think, the last slide I have, is that we have real deadlines that need to get met in U.S. healthcare. One is July 1st, where all the payers in the country are going to provide claims and other financial information to consumers across the U.S. And the other is January 1st, when we have to do something a little bit more complicated called payer-to-payer data exchange, which means one health plan can go get clinical data from any other health plan in the country and bring that back to the consumer. A lot of information there about publishing API endpoints, understanding trust, federation, all of that in a very, very short amount of time. So we're trying to do a lot of work, and a lot of great people are involved. And Don, with that, I'll turn it over to you. And now.
Well, thank you, Ryan. And if there's any questions, this would be a great time to bring them up, or we can defer them to the end. And Nat, I'll look to you.
think you're on mute, Nat.
Now you have audio, Nat. Thank you.
Can you hear me? All right. So thank you very much for your presentation. I much appreciate it. It was very, very interesting for me as well. And if you guys have any questions, please use the chat facilities that you have. And next, so thank you very much again for Ryan. So next up is Gail Hodges, our new executive director. So it's my honor to introduce Gail as new executive director, and I'm really looking forward to work with you. So Gail, it's your floor.
Thank you, Nat, and thank you for the warm welcome. I am, as you know, deeply honored to have the opportunity to lead the OpenID Foundation into its next chapter, and I'm grateful for the board for giving me this opportunity. I know I have a great deal to learn from not just the board, but all of the folks on the call and the wider OpenID Foundation community. There's clearly fantastic work that's been done over the last 10 years under Don's leadership and the board's guidance. And clearly the work of the OpenID Foundation, truly are pillars of the ecosystem, as Ryan was just sharing, right? So I think, it's an exciting time to be joining the OpenID Foundation, and I'm looking forward to Don and the board's counsel to bring me up to speed on the great work that's been done to date and to help chart the future, given how much opportunity there is. For those of you I haven't met in person, my background is in financial services and more recently in identity for 20, 25 years now. And the common theme of my work at American Express and HSBC, and most recently Apple, has been leading businesses through periods of material disruption. And often that's been digital disruption. And when I personally have looked at the digital identity landscape, I've seen a very fragmented space going through a profound period of change. And I personally, when I decided to leave Apple at the end of 2019, I saw an opportunity to help governments with the issuing of digital credentials like mobile driving licenses, national IDs, and mobile passports, because it's like the future is here now, but it's unevenly distributed. And so I wanted to help governments level up their game and help with them to issue credentials as a public good that would allow for use across the ecosystem for the kinds of applications that the OpenID Foundation has already been working deeply on. So Don and I had a chance to meet, I guess, over a year ago, and start looking at some of those topics together. And when I was approached to consider stepping into Don's shoes, I was intrigued, and I'm delighted to be taking on that responsibility now. So just as a context, I will be continuing with two hats, again, a little bit like Don. So we'll continue to do the nonprofit work with the Future Identity Council to help that agenda and help governments, at the same time as taking on the mantle as the executive director of the OpenID Foundation. So really looking forward to getting to know all of you in person. Thank you for your patience while I try to get up to speed as quickly as possible. And a full note of disclosure, I am not an engineer like many of you, but I try and learn fast. And I think my strength is in working across ecosystem participants in order to reach common goals. So looking forward to picking up from you, Don, and working with Nat and Mike and the rest of the board to help take us into the next chapter.
Thank you very much, Gail. It's going to be an interesting journey, I suppose, and I'm hoping that we are going to be able to open new, chapters and new doors, and get to the new frontier.
Absolutely, absolutely. I can't wait.
All right, thanks very much. So we'd like to go to the next agenda item, but there's a small change in the agenda. Originally, it was supposed to be the AV Connect working group, but I am actually swapping that with a Moderna working group, which is led by Bjorn. Bjorn, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so it's your floor.
Okie dokie. Here we go. So this is the Moderna working group update. So Moderna develops profiles for mobile network operators. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, but we are looking at the blank screen.
You are? Okay. That is strange.
Yeah.
Let's try this.
This is working, kind of.
Kind of working. Not
Yeah.
sure. What do you see now?
I'm seeing the slides not in the presentation mode. But we
do you see?
And it's not blank, it's white.
Okay.
So maybe we can just continue with this.
It's okay. We'll do it in a different way.
Okay.
How about now?
Yep, it's working.
Okay. Apparently, GoToMeeting doesn't like sharing applications.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So this is the Moderna working group update. So the purpose of the working group, for those not familiar with, is to support the GSMA technical development for Mobile Connect and to enable mobile network operators to become identity provider. The working group is developing profile as well as extension of OpenID Connect for use by the non-minnows as for their identity services. The group has several participants. There is a mix of both mobile network operators and vendors. So what is Mobile Connect? Mobile Connect is based on using your mobile phone number as your user identifier, using your mobile device as an authenticator, and the MNO being the identity provider with the intent of replacing password and hardware security tokens. So this is a summary of where the working group is right now. We have 4 of the specifications in implementers draft. Those are the authentication profile, the account porting, user questioning API, and CBAC core specifications. Since our last update last fall, we approved a second implementers draft of the user questioning API specifications. And most recently, we're starting preparing for the publication of the CBAC core final specification per request from the financial grade API working group. And so we're hoping to, I believe Dave mentioned that at the Fappy working group presentation he made earlier. So that will be a focus for the working group for the spring. In addition to that, The working group is also advancing the Moderna CBA profile, the discovery profile, and then the registration profile to implement this draft. The way we've done the CBA core or the CBA specifications is that we created a CBA core specification and then profiles of that CBA core. So there is a Fappy CBA profile as well as a Moderna CBA profile. The discovery and registration profile are still in draft forms, and the intent is to move them to implement this draft. Encouraging is that we're receiving feedback from deployments in both Europe and US. In US, there are pieces of the Moderna specifications that are deployed with Zenki, which is a joint venture among the 4 major or 3 now mobile network operators in US. And we also received input from Orange on some deployments in Europe. So that is very encouraging. The working group has also, as of late last year, started working on planning for OpenID certification of the various profiles and output of the working group. And so any information included the URL for anybody who's interested of the status and accessing the specifications. The Moderna Working Group also collaborates with other organizations, most specifically with GSMA. So there are 3 areas where, notably where OpenID Connect is applicable. One is obviously Mobile Connect architecture, and the other one is what's referred to as rich communication services that do support OpenID Connect. And lastly, the configuration of devices that uses an embedded SIM. Those can be open market devices or vertical applications. They use OpenID Connect for user authentication and input. As I mentioned, we have a strong collaboration with GSMA. They recently reorganized some of their work and created a new identity and data group that will replace the previous Mobile Connect interest group to develop identity products and services and also own the Mobile Connect specifications. So this group will develop requirements for these services and products based on from the group members, other GSMA communities, such as the financial services and automotive in, areas, and or from service providers who participate in the IDG. The intent is for any new requirements that impacts protocols or standards that they will be brought into the SDO community, either by members of the IAG or through liaisons. Any enhancements to OpenID Connect will be done in the Moderna working group. And so I believe we have mentioned at the previous workshop that we're working on a workshop with GSMA. We're now planning to have this workshop in early June, and the agenda will cover various technical work done by the OpenID Foundation that will be of interest to the GSMA membership. So not just Moderna, but additional work that may be applicable to GSMA. And finally, 3GPP, which is a standardized organization responsible for the technical standards that are the basis for majority of wireless networks around the globe, developed a support for mission critical services. And there is an identity management part of mission critical services. And what they developed was an OpenID Connect profile to support those services. The same architecture is also been adopted for what's referred to as service enabler architecture layer that is defining a way of supporting various vertical services, and that has an identity management component to it. So there will be a sealed OpenID Connect profile as well. So we're in early stages of interaction with 3DPP to create a liaison and hopefully bring this work into the OpenID Foundation. And I believe that is my update.
Thanks very much, Bjorn.
Sure.
And again, if there was one question or one comment from Tim on the chat window. Maybe you can comment back there.
Oh, it was just I didn't know RCS supported OIDC. That's really cool.
It does. It is one of their options. It's also what is done for device onboarding is based on the work done in RCS. So there is a OpenID Connect portions of that is supported, and that is inherent into how you do device onboarding. And so you could imagine in a way where as you onboard a new device that the user has to agree to the terms and conditions, and that's where OIDC will come in.
Cool.
Yes.
Gail, we got to get your old Apple friends to implement it now.
We're working on it.
No pressure.
They have their own view of entitlement service, so but they did join FIDO, so they're just slow to the table.
All right, thanks very much, Bjorn.
Sure.
So next item is kind of interesting. Maybe Don, you may want to introduce the session.
Well, I think it is interesting, and it really is something that kind of came to us organically through some of the conversations that our colleagues from Google have been having informally in the community at large about new cookie policies and practices. So what the OpenID Foundation wanted to do was to take advantage of some of the leadership from our community by George Fletcher, Vittorio, Tim from Microsoft and others, and take what was a largely ad hoc conversation and begin to put some edges around it so that we could share it with all of you who are here attending the Foundation workshop. So we wanted to share that this is kind of the second in that ongoing conversation, an opportunity for Heather to bring us up to date, give us the status of where that conversation stands, and then begin to talk about what kind of follow-up we might have from this conversation. So I wanted to assure you that this was not a one and done type of conversation, but really an effort by our colleagues from Google and the community at large to dig into some of the challenges that these changes present to us as technicians and as member of the foundation. So let me turn it over to Heather, and she's going to lead that conversation. I should say one last thing as part of my shameless plugs. Vittorio's podcast on this topic, I think, would be a great deep dive for those of you that want to get a sense of the background and some of the nuance here. So over to you, Heather.
Okay. First, I actually know several of you that are in the audience today, and I wanted to say, hi, I miss you. And I really hope to see you again soon in a hallway or at a conference bar sometime again soon. So we only have about 15 minutes, and this is a great big topic where I can give you a lot of updates as to what we've talked about, what I know, where to find more information, but there's going to be some things where you're going to want more concrete information and it's not there yet. So this is very much a teaser, and I hope it encourages you to participate where you can in the conversations that are ongoing. So what can we talk about in 15 minutes or less? We can talk a little bit about sort of the problem statements and why those are interesting. I can give you that status, and I can tell you where the conversations are happening, and you can decide where you can help move that ball. So the problem statements for me are particularly interesting because they are all important, and they are at cross purposes, and we don't know that everybody has a consensus on that these are in fact the problems that are causing this complicated cascade of related issues. So on the one hand, browsers need to prevent tracking users across the web. They have a mandate to do something about privacy. This is one of the single most important motivators, if not the most important motivator, for the changes that they're making. It's their driving force. Next problem, applications and services need to work through the browser to support single sign-on and federated login. This is also a very known thing. This has to happen. This is a very common and valid thing to do. But then you get to the last component of it, which sort of encapsulates the problem, which is that federated login and ad tracking tools use the same primitives, and from the browser's perspective are virtually indistinguishable. Well, that's a problem. So depending on who you talk to, it may be, maybe it is more important that, it doesn't matter what you break as long as you enable privacy for the user. That's certainly a perspective. It also may be that you're coming from but my company or my university or my perfectly valid use case in healthcare needs to still be able to log in and whatnot. How can you possibly be considering breaking this for me? This tension is not resolved. And again, this way of describing of the problem isn't signed off on by, say, every browser vendor or otherwise coming in there. But it is my observation so far. Okay, so what's the status of all this work? There are some key explainers on the topic. If you haven't read the WebID README file, I think you should. It gives you a very good sense of the scale of the problem and the different ways that we're trying to approach resolving it. This is not a one and done explainer. It's been updated as recently as I think yesterday. So keep an eye on it, watch that repository, and feel free to comment if you think that something is captured incorrectly, or even better, if you see a description of, we think this architecture might work, chime in, it will help. Immediately relevant to the OpenID Foundation, of course, is we have the browser interaction group. I don't know if I should be calling it a special interest group or exactly the right terminology, but suffice to say, we have that group. That group has a GitHub repository where we've captured some of the issues of, okay, if you assume that browsers are going to do what they have to do to prevent tracking without consent of some kind, what does that look like? What things will break? Can we prioritize the issues of those things? So we've done that. That's in that issues list. The hope is that for each one of those things identified, we're going to have a specific scenario that explains in detail how does it break? Why does it break? What exactly is it using, and in what manner that this thing is breaking? We actually have a couple of scenarios already documented. If you wanted to look at, for example, the identity provider discovery use case, which is protocol agnostic, that will show you Here's what we're talking about in terms of what primitives are used. It links to a sequence diagram so you can follow the path of what's happening and when. That's the kind of thing that will be very constructive for our conversation, because a lot of conversations to date have been a bit more on the panicky and dramatic side of, no, wait, this is going to break. All of it will break. Oh, noes. We need to get out of drama and into, okay, no, exactly from a technical perspective, what are we talking about? Now, one of the challenges here is several organizations are grappling with different perspectives on the problem at hand. So the IETF has, of course, the OAuth 2 working group, and the scenarios are actually, in a way, falling under the auspices of that, even though they're also feeding into the OpenID Foundation interest group. We have that browser interaction special interest group. We also have the World Wide Web Consortium's WCG, the Web Incubator Community Group, which is where the WebID work is happening itself. But the W3C also has the Privacy Community Group, which is very, very interested in this space. It doesn't have a lot of identity, identity and access management professionals there. So they've got a perspective, and they don't necessarily see some of the identity implications outside of how do you protect a user's privacy. Higher education is also very interested in what's going on, even though they're not so much OpenID Connect deployers. This is more a SAML community. They are just as impacted as people using OpenID are going to be. And so the InCommon, which is the largest academic identity federation in the US, they have a technical advisory committee. I'm vice chair. And they're actively monitoring, trying to figure out how do they engage in this space. The Arnie Federations group called ReFeds is an informal consortia of over 80 academic federations around the world. They're also watching, and conversations are happening in every area. So that's a lot of places to have this conversation. And I suspect you probably want a little bit more of, okay, no, well, but really, what's happening here? So there's a lot of changes. When you talk about how are things tracked on the web, how are people tracked on the web? They're tracked via cookies, particularly third-party cookies, and they're tracked via link decoration. Third-party cookies are what's going to be hit first. Without a doubt, they're going to be hit sooner rather than later. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But again, that's just the first point of contact. In the next 2 to 3 years, link decoration, things like query strings in the URL, are going to be the next logical target in the sequence of events. And that's going to be an even bigger impact on the functionality of OpenID Connect and on SAML that we'll need to be paying attention to. As much as we want to focus on everything about the cookies right now, because it's the most urgent point of concern, we need to be thinking what the long-term gain is. At the end of the day, nobody wants to have to address browser code and say, okay, we're going to fix cookies this way. Did that just box us into something with regards to the future directions we need to go? We actually need to have a strategy and an architecture that looks at the big picture, as opposed to just trying to fix this piecemeal. Even though cookies are good in pieces, it's not going to help us here. So, all right, some immediate impacts, since we're talking about what's going to be an issue in the immediate future, assuming it isn't already, which actually it really is. So we know several OpenID Connect OAuth 2 features will break. We know front channel logout is a problem. Session management, iframe-based session extension, SPA background token renewal, all of those things are breaking if they're not already broken. SAML single logout will break. Now, just about anyone who's ever touched SAML at this point will sit back and go, oh, but that's been such a pain to implement anyway. That's true, but it's still kind of important, and it's not going to work. IDP persistence, where someone has written something into browser local storage as a cross-origin activity, such that the choice of IDP is going to persist from one service provider to the next as they go through an IDP discovery process. That's going to break too, or at least be seriously wounded. Now, why I fiddle a bit with saying some things that will break and or are breaking, because in our timeline of the 3 major browser vendors for Safari, it's already broken. If you want to see an example of how things will break in some interesting manners, try and use Safari for something like, for example, Microsoft Teams. Doesn't work very well. There's a lot of things that don't work very well, and unfortunately the answer has largely been by the service providers that are stuck in this situation is, well, the fix is don't use Safari. That's true, but it's not going to help them for a whole lot longer. Firefox, third-party cookies are blocked under certain circumstances, and there are specific heuristics for this. And that's only going to grow. Now, whether they'll continue using heuristics or whether they'll move to something else is a lot of it depends right now. We don't know. And with Chrome, it's, third-party cookies are already blocked by default on iOS, but there's going to be, there are other platforms and whatnot, and we're expecting that it will be breaking within the next, let's say 6 to 9 months. All right, so that's a lot. What do you do now? Well, now's when you need to, if you haven't already been engaging in this problem, you need to. We've been talking about having a sort of a co-hosted web ID workshop at the end of May. That's still kind of tentative because I don't know whether we're going to have it be sort of a general FYI workshop on the state of the universe. I'd really like it if I could get each of the major browser vendors there to talk about it, but of course that means they need to jump through legal hoops and get permission about what they're allowed to say in mixed company and all that other fun stuff. Or it may turn out to be a much more general conversation. I don't 100% know. We need to have this conversation in the open. We need to get the different groups that are all having this conversation at least to have some touch point in the middle so that the privacy community group, for example, hears what the browser interaction group is saying, which also hears what other interest groups need to say in this topic. We've got to have that touch point to come back together. So stay tuned on that one. I'll get more information out, and I know Dawn and others are going to help me with that once we have the agenda sorted out in a bit more detail. Now I also have Tim Capelli and Sam Godar here to help answer any other questions that may come up. I don't know if we want to do those now, if we want to do those in the chat, or if we want to do those at the end of the workshop. Nat, what would you like?
I actually think we have a few minutes for the questions right now.
Let me open the chat so I can see what people might be typing. Okay, well, I hope this was useful. I know it was a quick zip through, and I wish I had more concrete information for you of this will break, therefore do the following, but we don't quite have that yet, so stay tuned. In terms of a place to keep an eye out for the workshops, the WCG WebID GitHub repository is going to have a folder for meetings. Once we know when the meetings are and as we start to have agendas, we're hoping to have a bit more in the way of regular calls as we figure this stuff out. So that would be a good place to look for that. And I believe that there will probably be announcements through OpenID Foundation channels as well. And there's no place to sign up for the workshop yet because it's still it's a glint in my eye. But as soon as we have that, we'll let you know. I will be giving this presentation to Mike so that he can put it on whatever websites that the meeting notes for today will be distributed to. And to get any others, I think that's everything. I guess I can mention, and this is now is very informal. A lot of my research and education colleagues who live in the SAML world have been a bit farther in orbit around this than all of you. And so they've asked me to come and just chat with them about what I know. And it is very much a what I know, not a any particular browser vendor says in private. This is all public information that I've been hearing about and pulling together and whatnot. I'll be doing an very informal BOF next week. If you really want to be part of that, knowing that it will be R&E style, please feel free to drop me a note. Send me a private note in the chat right here, and I will go ahead and add you. Okay.
So Sam and Tim, do you want to say a few words?
Nothing on my side. We certainly appreciate the opportunity, the engagement to work with you all. For Heather for helping us navigate some of this, and again making myself available for any questions either here or elsewhere. We want to hear from you.
Yeah, I guess I would say as the use cases get submitted, folks are starting to submit these documented use cases. If you can throw comments on them in GitHub just to start a discussion, that would be super helpful. Or if you want to volunteer to write one, we're more than welcome. We're welcoming anyone who wants to do that too.
Really helpful, just saying.
Anything in that GitHub issue list that's marked as a use case without an assignee is up for grabs. So.
For what is worth, the work that we've been doing in browser side is to look at each of these use cases sorted by what's most urgent and trying to offer alternatives. And kind of like the first very concrete example of one of those is logout that we recently published how we're imagining this could go. It's 100%, I'm 100% sure that it's wrong, but the only way to figure out where it's wrong is to write code and gather implementation experience. And so logout is already something that we believe we have an answer for, but we want to learn where we're wrong. And so I would encourage you all to, if you run one of these services and you use logout and you want it to be preserved, then give it a try, see if it works, tell us when it doesn't, and then we'll keep working until it does. I'll paste the link for instructions in the chat.
Thanks, Sam. So, Heather?
Mm-hmm.
That's it?
That's it for us.
All right. What about you, Don?
Yeah, just to remind everybody that we're working closely with Heather and Sam, and we're doing our best to bring this to the community's attention and to do so in a structured way. So we'll keep you up to date on developments. Just keep an eye on the OpenID Foundation website.
All right, that's great. Thanks very much, Heather, Sam, and Tim, and Don. That was a great session. So next up is actually FastFed, led by Darren McAdams. Yes.
Yeah, hey. Just to confirm, can you see my screen?
Yes, very well.
Perfect.
And you can hear very well as well.
Perfect.
Well,
let me get. All right, I'll get going on FastFed then. So I guess if nobody's heard, if there are folks who haven't heard of FastFed, I'll talk a little bit about kind of what it is later. But I think for those who have been tracking it, I'll just give a quick update. So when we were all together 6 months ago, we were just about to call for another vote on implementer's draft. And where we are now is that we have now made it to implementer's draft. So thanks to everyone for voting. And of course, up next implementer's draft is implementation. The folks in FastFed are largely, it's an enterprise ecosystem, and so I'll talk a little bit about where we are. Oh, Victoria also said there's a podcast episode. I'll talk a little bit where we are, but it's pretty much enterprise planning cycles and trying to figure out where this falls on the calendar. And COVID's just sort of made that all a little bit weird because we don't have the normal cadence of our conferences and such that we used to. But just quickly, for any folks who happen to be totally new to what FastFed is, it was started to address a specific problem, which is that we get together in these groups and talk about all these cool single sign-on protocols. But in the enterprise settings, we sort of, I happen to work for AWS, but other folks as well. We looked at our metrics, and our customers coming to us, we were actually seeing very low adoption of federation rates. And so it sparked some introspection on why. And it was basically, it's hard to configure. And this example that I often show a bunch happens to be from G Suite. It shows the age of this slide. The product name has changed. But basically, this was setting up single sign-on. And it's 44 convenient steps with all this expertise, like ACS URLs and entity IDs, and pretty much you have to be an identity expert to even work through them. And this was just pain for everyone, the system administrator who's setting it up, the identity providers, the service providers. Like nobody was really enjoying this. And the root problem kind of comes down to the fact that today's experience in the enterprise world for setting up single sign-on is this poor administrator has to copy and paste all these configuration values back and forth, and they'll have 4 browser windows open, and they got to get it exactly right or it doesn't work. And if you're an expert at this, if maybe you come to these sessions and you live and breathe identity, you can do this in a few minutes. If you are not that person, it can take you weeks. And so that's the challenge. And so really we're saying, how do we get that person out of the middle and just let these computers exchange the information they need with each other? Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of the protocol and everything like that. We have materials out there. There's a YouTube session, and of course, all the spec discussion artifacts and everything, if you'd like to learn more, is all in the OpenID Foundation Bitbucket repo. However, while we're all here, I'll answer, I tend to do this each time because there's 2 common FAQs that seem to arise every time we talk about FastFed, so I'll just quickly answer those again. One that comes up all the time is FastFed trying to replace all these other protocols we're talking about? Like, no, of course not. But it does try to tackle those 44 steps that it takes to set them up. So it's trying to tackle that user challenge. Also, each of these protocols are, of course, very broad, handle many use cases. In an enterprise world, for example, it's, if I'm an app developer, which subset do I need to pay attention to so that whether it's Azure, Okta, Google, et cetera, all these, like I know those identity providers will work with my app. What should I do? And it turned out there really wasn't that good of a consistent answer. Another question that comes up is what's the difference between FastFed and I saw Roland's here today. There's another OpenID working group named OpenID Federation. This is just a quirk that we use the word federation to sort of refer to completely different things with the benefit that we get to confuse everyone. So they're solving different problems. For FastFed, we're referring to, especially in the enterprise space, using federation as sort of the shorthand for setting up single sign-on and perhaps user provisioning with SCIM. Whereas OpenID Federation is coming from the like higher ed sort of research sector, where federation means something slightly different. It's like in common, it's a club of folks who have agreed to a certain way of behaving, perhaps even going through an audit and being able to attest and prove that you're in this club. So they're both complementary, but just we use the word federation for different things. So the current status, as I mentioned, we're in that enterprise planning cycle. But I think, as I mentioned last time, this still remains true. This isn't going to be a big bang, like, hey, we lift the curtain and FastFed is live. This is much more iterative. And what I mean by that is FastFed is already delivering value in some places like SCIM. And what I mean by that is, I talked about FastFed helping to make sure that all these systems, defining profiles, making sure all these systems are interoperable. So those 44 steps are really just, 1 or 2 steps. So for example, there's a SCIM profile that says, oh, you want to create a user, update a user, etc. Here's the ways to do so. So we tackled that first, and the reason we started there is, here so I work for AWS, and I think we implemented inbound SCIM, so you could provision data into AWS, and we started off integrating with Azure AD, got that working, and then of course next customers would come to us from other providers, Okta, etc., Google, and of course none of it worked. Everyone did SCIM slightly differently. And so we sort of took a stance. This was a few months ago, saying, you know what, AWS supports the OpenID FastFed SCIM profile, and that's what we support. So you should support that too. And that's actually gotten a bunch of traction. And so we've integrated with all these providers, sort of adhering to that protocol. So that's what I mean by it's sort of iteratively delivering value. The next thing I think we're going to approach is SAML, getting these building blocks in place. With SAML, it's aspects like certificate rotation and things that you really need to get in place to make it so that these technologies can be set up by someone who has no idea how they actually work. And if we made a push button experience to configure SAML and then a year later it broke when certificates expired and now this person has to become a domain expert to fix it, we haven't succeeded on the FastFed goal. So that's an example of some of the SAML sort of enhancements, the SAML profile we want to get in place. And then just kind of building up the stack to fit the whole handshake. And then, of course, other profiles like OpenID Connect and such. And finally, there is an open source for Java. We have FastFed for J that we've been working on. If you go looking for documentation, it's not super great yet. If anyone really is interested in getting their hands into it, just shoot me an email and I'll help you navigate. But not only is this an open source implementation, but it's also a bit of a compliance checker where it makes sure as data comes in and out that you're complying with the spec. So we see the same utility being useful as part of the compliance toolkit as well. So that's where we're at today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Larry.
Sure.
So as usual, you guys can post questions so that Larry may be able to answer on the chat, or perhaps you can take the question at the end of this workshop. Looks like we are going to have a little more extra time for the questions and answer if we go at this pace. All right, so next one up is AB Connect Working Group, updates by Mike Jones. Okay, Mike, it's your floor.
All right, well, thank you all for being here. There's a ton of useful information. I know I'm learning and I'm impressed with all the work that's happening. I'm here for a few minutes to talk with you about the state of the work in the OpenID Connect working group, which is one of our longest standing working groups. So you're almost certainly using OpenID Connect. I think most of you know this, that while it's not a consumer brand, it's very commonly used infrastructure. If you have an Android phone, if you sign in with Apple, if you use the Japanese mobile carriers or Deutsche Telekom or Google or Microsoft or Salesforce or many other things, you're using the OpenID Connect protocol for doing the sign-in. So we're happy with what we've achieved, and the adoption, of course, continues apace. So this is a diagram of the specs that we created as we were taking them final. There's been more work since this, and I won't belabor this. The interesting point that remains true is that there's a bunch of work done in the OpenID Foundation, as well as there's work done in the IETF on some of the underpinnings that we've used, in particular the JSON Web Token or JOT specification. So let me talk about some of the work that is ongoing. Probably the longest standing ongoing work has to do with logout. there's 3 different approaches specified by the working group, because unfortunately, due to the way the web works and the way the web is changing, there's not one approach that works for all use cases. So there's a session management logout approach using HTML5 post message. There's front channel logout, which is a lot like what is done with SAML or WSFed, where you use a get to load an iframe or an image. And there's back channel logout, which is not going to break when the browsers change cookies, but it's harder to implement. But some financial services applications wanted something that didn't use the front channel so that it could be reliable. All support multiple logged in sessions, and all 3 can be initiated from the relying party using the RP initiated logout. So where we are with this work, the working group agreed to do some updates to the RP initiated logout spec. There's some tweaks to correct session management. And then I think we're at a point we should take these to final. That being said, you know, there's caveats in these that some of this may break when the browsers make some changes, which we've just talked about. But I think there's value in recording what we've been actually doing for 5-6 years. And if we then need to do something else, we'll do a 4th modality. But that's active work. I encourage you to join the working group calls to talk about it. Darren just mentioned the OpenID Connect Federation spec, which can be used to establish and maintain large multi-party federations using OpenID Connect, much like InCommon or EduGain or NordGNet or some of the other academic and research federations use SAML today. This work is led by Roland Hedberg, who's on the call, with some help from me and John Bradley, and Heather's pitched in on this. We probably are about to advance to 3rd implementers draft in preparation for finishing this. We did do 3 rounds of interop testing last year and learned a ton from the developers building it and trying it. And as we did with Connect itself, we iterated on that and improved it. So there's a native single sign-on specification where apps from the same organization can do sign-in on your mobile phones without having to sign each one in individually. So for instance, AOL and Yahoo and MapQuest and some other properties are all owned by, I think it's Verizon Media now, and they can use this to do sign-in across their apps. There's a tiny spec on unmet authentication requirements, defining a new error code that Torsten's written that actually came out of motivations from some of the eKYC work. I think we could just finish this. The working group should decide whether to do that, but that's in production use. There's another one that George created called Prompt Create for initiating user registration via OpenID Connect, as opposed to just signing in users who already exist. It requests enabling account creation during authentication if the user's not already, doesn't already have an account. That's another one that it would be great to have you review. There's some work by Nat Sakamura and Edmund J, among others, on claims aggregation, which Christina also mentioned in her presentation in the first session, that enables relying parties to request claims from third-party claims providers that are not the OP to be sent through the OP as part of their interactions. Now, OpenID Connect already defined the aggregated and distributed claims formats for representing these third-party claims, but we didn't say how to request them and some other details. So this is good new work that I think there's demonstrated need for. This also will probably be merged with some other work on enabling requesting and returning verifiable credentials objects, which is another format of verified claims. A little more boring, but still important. You know, while we did a good job on Connect and reviewing it before we finished it, inevitably small mistakes will be made. And the errata process is there in the OpenID Foundation process to correct typos and other mistakes. So this has been running for a while. I still have a few more errata edits to make, but we should try to finish this second errata set this calendar year. And this largely overlaps what Christina was talking about, but I didn't want to talk about the Connect working group without also mention the self-issued OpenID provider work. The core spec did define that, and some extensions are being defined by the working group as described by Christina. One of the things that this can be used for is DID authentication. Another thing that it's being used for is in the mobile driver's license world. If you use a self-issued provider to request use of your mobile driver's license, then you're not what they call calling home every time you use it. Just like if you present your physical driver's license in a restaurant to buy a bottle of wine, they're not contacting, in my case, the Washington State Department of Motor Vehicles to say that Mike just used his driver's license. Well, we want the same property in the online world. And the mobile driver's license work, which Christina also alluded to, uses the SIOP provider to accomplish that. So I thought I'd write down a couple other bleeding edge things that are happening but are part of the current work. There's some use cases people have to use verifiable credentials objects as defined by the W3C with OpenID Connect flows. And as Christina said, there's discussion about how we want to represent them, both as claims and or possibly as new protocol artifacts. And we'll get some implementation experience, as we often do, and try to decide. In some sense, this is parallel to the OpenID Connect for identity assurance work that eKYC IDA has done, in that it's another representation of verified claims. Also, there's some interest in portable identifiers. While current identifiers for you are specific to the provider, so you might have a Google account, which is always going to stay at Google, or you might have an account with Salesforce or what have you. There's some interest in defining how you could have accounts that you could change providers without losing sort of all the state. And that's really early work, but it's interesting work. And if you're interested in that, also participate in the working group. Again, I also wanted to touch on that we extensively use the certification program, as Joseph described a little bit earlier, that we believe that OpenID certification has been key to having implementations be high quality and more secure, as well as being more interoperable. As I believe Joseph said, there's two legs that this stands on. One is there's technical evidence that you ran tests and you passed them, so that, say, if you don't believe that Microsoft passed, you could look at our logs and say, well, does it look like they ran the tests and they worked or not? And there's also a legal statement that you make. In a longer version of this presentation, I would show a PDF signed by Ping Identity when they did their first certification, saying, yes, we ran them, and yes, we state that that's true. There's a whole bunch of related work, and you've heard some of it today, and I'm not going to belabor this. There's the eKYC, the Moderna work for mobile operators. There's Fappy, research and education. There's also an international government profile and the enhanced authentication profile. So Connect is being used as a baseline to do a lot of additional work. I joke with friends that when we finished Connect, because it succeeded, it doesn't mean that we're done. What it actually means is there's gobs of follow-up work that people want to do to extend it to be used in very specific ways and additional profiles, and that's a sign of success. Finally, there's a set of URLs here that you can use for resources. OpenID.net/connect is the primary one. And I'll put these slides up on my blog later today, and then Mike Les can incorporate these and others into the workshop notes. With that, I'm gonna stop talking and see if people have questions they want to ask me now, or I think we're still good on time. So, but Mike Les or Nat, feel free to take the podium away from me virtually as well.
Yeah, I believe we still have time. So if there's any questions, we could actually field it. Sam just wrote on the chat that saying that's interesting work that I think has some interaction with WebID, and that was about self-issued, right, Sam?
Yes. Sorry, I'm still learning how to use chat, so apologies if I'm more chatty than I should. But yes, yeah, it was just wonderful to read about that work. I'm just now learning about the self-issued OpenID Connect work, so I just reacting based on something very skimming through the spec. I think like we're running into a similar problem ourselves, and so it would be great to. I believe there's some intersection there, at least from a kind of like problem statement perspective. It seems like there's some intersection. The use case that Mike just mentioned. What's it, driver's license? I think it's something that I think we also empathize with. We've been running into like a very specific problem, combining both self-issuing as well as direct identifiers has been hard on us. And so if there's prior art that we can look at and reuse stuff, that would be wonderful. I'll try to connect with both Mike and Christina, who's been very helpful in the chat too.
Great, thanks, Sam. Anyone else? All right, well, with that, thank you for your time, and I look forward to some more presentations and discussions.
All right, thanks, Mike. So next up is Shared Signals and Events Working Group, which is going to be presented by Atul. Atul, are you there? All right, that's great. I'm seeing the slide now. So floor is yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. I got the confirmation that everyone can see my slides. So great to be here. Thanks for having me speak about the Shared Signals and Events Working Group. Let me jump right in. The Shared Signals and Events Framework is sort of the main output of the working group. It describes how independent entities, such as a policy server and a relying party in this example, can share state that are relevant to the principles that they share. And the principles could be of type, tenants or OUs or users or sessions, devices, applications. Those are the ones that are defined today in the spec, but there may be more. The exchange of the state is done through publishing and subscribing of security event tokens or sets. And then what the framework defines is an event stream management API that allows the trust to be set up and the streams to be enabled, disabled, and various subjects to be added, removed, and all those from it. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay, yeah.
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah, thanks. The event stream management API part of the shared signals and events framework has one part is the transmitter configuration metadata. The configuration metadata describes a transmitter to a receiver, and that can include things like the signing key that is being used, various URLs at which various services are available. But the receiver, in this case, can also post or update the transmitter configuration metadata to specify at the URL at which the receiver will receive events, and what is the delivery mechanism. So we in the framework we support two mechanisms. One is the set push, which in which the transmitter opens an HTTP connection to the receiver and sends the set through that HTTP request. And then there is a set poll, which in which the receiver will poll the transmitter for the events. Using the post method of the transmitter configuration metadata, the receiver can actually specify how it wants to receive events and where. Now there is also a stream status endpoint, which allows the receiver to see if the stream is active or not, and also to post to that endpoint to specify whether or not to pause or disable or enable a particular stream. There are also endpoints to add specific subjects. So let's say there are two peers who one is a transmitter and one is a receiver, and let's say they want to enable the stream for a particular tenant, right? So they can do that using an add subject method call. Similarly, they can do that for individual users or OUs or any of the subject principals that we defined. The same thing they can do for removing subjects. And there is also a method to verify the status of a stream. So how that works is the receiver posts a verification request, and the transmitter actually sends an event through the stream just like a normal event, so that the receiver can verify the liveness. The transmitter can also unilaterally kind of update the stream, and the the stream can the transmitter can say, I'm pausing the stream for this subject principal, or I'm disabling it for this subject principal, or I'm enabling it for this subject principal. And that can be a unilateral action from the transmitter. Now let's take a quick look at the subjects in the SSE framework. The simple subject is just a format identifier like the one I've shown here is of type email, but you could have other types like phone number or issuer sub or maybe some others. Um, the the more complex subject types are where the same subject principle may be described using multiple attributes. So, for example, in this particular example, what you see is that we are specifying the subject as belonging to a certain tenant, a particular user and a particular session within that, that tenant and that user, right? So the important thing to note is that it's always an and semantic for all the members of a subject claim, and what that means is that together that subject identifier is always going to specify a single principle. It cannot be used to specify multiple principles in the same event. Moving to sort of how SSE is used, and this is where sort of what used to be the risk working group, which had a set of specifications, is now called the shared signals and events working group, because we find that the same mechanism is useful in other applications and not just risk. And so while risk is the existing application of the shared signals and events, the new application is what we're calling CAPE. It used to be called Continuous Access Evaluation Protocol, but now the specification is being called Continuous Access Evaluation Profile of the SSE framework, right? Now, I'll focus a little bit on the events in CAPE because these are new. So, for example, we expect CAPE to be a more frequently used sort of event type, because it doesn't necessarily indicate like a account compromise or some exceptional event like what CAPE or what risk was designed for. But we expect these to be normal events that alter the access properties of a user. And so as a result, there'll be more frequent events. So, for example, if a user changes their password, the transmitter can send a credential change event. There was some discussion about single logout and how that may not work with some of the changes in the browser technology. But here's a token claims change that can be used to actually indicate that a previously issued token is no longer valid. And because this can be tuned to a specific session, you can actually remove it for for an individual session or for a user in general, to remove all tokens issued to a user. But those are the kinds of events that can be used to convey access changes. So same thing, level of assurance change. Maybe a user is starting to use a multi-factor authentication, or maybe the user, the assurance level of a user has changed because of some environmental reasons. Device compliance change can be issued where, let's say, a device that was compliant failed to check in with the device management service, and as a result, the device compliance change can indicate that the device is no longer compliant, and then the receiver can make an appropriate decision about whether or not to allow that user to continue to access their resources or not. So that's a brief overview of the current applications. There has been some interest in using SSE for other applications, but those are the two right now that are specified, and there are sort of specs available in the repository for these. So let's look at where we are. So we were working for a long time on a branch of the master, which we were calling the CAPE Draft 01 branch. We have recently merged that into the master branch, and so now we will be requesting the OpenID board to start the comment period in order to make this an implementer's draft. So there are no open items right now within the working group, and so we are ready to receive comments from outside. And then I would like to touch upon a little bit on the work that's going on. We have been fortunate that there is a good amount of interest among a number of companies to adopt CAPE and SSE. And so let's go through some of those things right now. Google has been operating a cross-account protection service that is based on the RISC protocol for some time now, and we're working on a proof of concept CAPE implementation with some third parties on different use cases. Microsoft has made a few announcements in the last year about how they're using continuous access evaluation, which incorporates the CAPE event types with set push across multiple Microsoft services. I think Exchange Online and Teams were mentioned in one of the press releases. And then they're also working with some third parties for in the revocation use case and using SSE and CAPE for that purpose. Now, SailPoint has developed an open source Java library, and this was really good for us to have because it helped us debug the spec a little bit. And so, thanks very much to SailPoint for making this contribution. And so you can actually download the Java library from the repository there, and start playing with it to adopt CAPE and SSE and RISC. Now Thales has also started working on a proof of concept with a third-party partner, and their use case is very interesting in that in this case the sort of the event begins at a service provider. So the service provider, maybe due to the user's anomalous behavior, declares that the user may be is a suspect user, and so therefore it sends the event to the IDP, and then the IDP recomputes their own sort of policy about the same user, and then they send CAPE events to other SPs that the user is logged into. So this is something that Thales is working on as a proof of concept. That's all I had. I don't know. I guess I finished a little early, so we have a little bit of time for questions. I'm going to look at the chat. Oh, quick shout out to Vittorio. A couple of us, Tim and I, were on a Identity Unlocked podcast a few weeks back, and I think in the comment section you will see that Vittorio has posted the link to that podcast. Thanks, Vittorio.
Thanks, Atul. Yes, indeed, we do have some time for questions. Hey, Vittorio, did you want to say something? So, Don, did you want to say something?
No, I was waiting for Vittorio to complain about American coffee. But no, I think the shared signals work is some of the most underappreciated work in the foundation and the community at large. I think it's great to get this attention on it and to be able to take the deep dive on the podcast that Vittorio has arranged. But I think that's it for me, Nat.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this work is really important for a framework like Zero Trust Network or Zero Trust in a framework. Is that right?
Yeah. So I think from a zero trust point of view, it's important to see, how the attacker's view would change, because it's going from trying to compromise the perimeter to trying to compromise the sort of the endpoint or the user account that is used to access various services. And so as a result, it becomes very important to tune the access dynamically, which is not typically afforded by the federated identity protocols, which you authenticate once and then you're sort of logged in forever. And so something like CAPE is very important to improving the zero trust security.
That's great. Thanks very much. And Tim, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I threw it in the chat, but Tool and I are actually going to do a session on Zero Trust and Cape. We didn't plant the question with that, I swear, at Identiverse. And one other, just comment on, that one of the reasons, Microsoft has invested heavily is, especially with work from home, scale has become a huge challenge, right? So being able to extend some of our resources to use a 24-hour access token instead of an hour, because we can now send a session revocation, has huge benefits for resiliency and just overall scale. So very, very timely work, unintentionally.
That's great. All right, so if there's no more questions, we can, thanks very much, Atul, for
Thank you.
taking time. It's really good that I could catch up with the work. It's one of my favorite working group, actually, to track, because I always believe that this is going to be really, really important work.
Thanks.
All right, so the last thing we have in this workshop is open Q&A session. So maybe if you guys have something to ask or some comments, I guess you guys can, turn the mute off and speak, or if you turn the mic mute off, then I'll probably be able to see that on the screen and can call your name so that you can speak. All right, AC? Well, I'm not hearing you.
Ned, I will mention that the next time we'll be meeting in the OpenID Foundation workshop like this will be closely associated with the Coppinger-Cole European Identity Conference, now slated as a hybrid event in September.
Mm-hmm.
So for those of you that enjoy this kind of quick review, we'll be able to do that at the end of the summer. We do support the Identiverse conference as a sponsor, but we don't have any in-person events scheduled for Denver.
That's right. Well, hopefully we'll be able to hold an in-person thing in not too distant time. So Atul, did you want to speak?
Yeah, no, I was just asking about the same thing, which is the in-person, is the next one going to be in person or not?
Yeah. It'll take some more time for everybody to get vaccinated, I guess.
That's true, yeah.
Anybody? Okay, so if there is nothing.
Sorry, Nat. Can I
Sure.
ask one question? Yeah.
Please.
Thank you for great conference, and I'd like to ask one question about cookie problem of browsers. And as Heather mentions, cookie problem is a quite big impact to OpenID Connect roles or SAML. Is there any timeline to fix the problem from the OpenID Connect side to the browser problem?
All right, so it's mainly affecting things like logout. Mike Jones, could you take the question?
Could you repeat the question, please?
Okay. Browsers cookie problem in the browser is quite huge impact on the OpenID Connect. And so, are there any timeline to align the problem from the OpenID Connect spec side to the browser problem?
You know, as both Heather and Sam were talking about, we're in the middle of a information gathering and discussion and negotiation process to try to figure out what the browsers we're going to have are going to do and not do within the next few years. And as Heather also correctly pointed out, that not all the browsers are aligned to do the same things right now, nor is there necessarily a timeline or commitment to get them to do so. So, you know, some of the subject matter experts are on this call and we're engaging in the conversation. And we could write a new draft spec, as I said, possibly modeled after the link that Sam sent us, giving us one more way to signal log out. But, you know, I think we want to build some things and iterate as the browsers evolve until we believe we have reason to believe that our browser infrastructure is stable again. I think the best we can do is experiment and be part of the conversation. I don't think there's a timeline.
Okay.
But come to Heather's workshop at the end of May and let's talk about it.
Okay.
And I'm going to chime in. One of my biggest concerns in all the, you know, I get to participate in just about all the groups that are having any conversations about this, as far as I'm aware. And there's a whole lot of people taking a wait and see attitude. They're waiting to see, all right, well, what's going to be decided about how this will work. And especially in this situation, that's an incredibly unfortunate attitude to take, because the implications range from the protocols, the standards themselves not being ready, and therefore any application that you have not being something that can adjust to meet the new reality. If you think at all that you're going to be impacted by this, then you have to be a part of that conversation to be as aware and to help guide what direction the answers are going to take. Stuff will change. There's no stopping that. This is not a moment for the grief process and being in denial with saying, but my use case is so critical you can't possibly change till I'm ready. Not a viable option.
Okay. So, are there any recommendation for implementers or company who want to implement OpenID provider now? For example, do not use front channel logout and so on.
I think that's what the next few months are going to be about, right? I don't think we're at a point where we can make any recommendations until some of this gets ironed out, right? So that's what, you know, Sam is working on, is iterating through these challenges. And once there's some level of consensus on whether that's the right way to solve these problems, then I think guidance would change. But like as of right now, we're not telling anyone to do anything for better or worse. And I know that's tough, but.
Can I add something in this context? Although it's true that we are discussing and we have some chances of influencing where browsers are going. As I mentioned in some of the calls in the last few months, I think it would be prudent on our side to also consider B plans and worst case scenarios. Let's say that imagine that all the discussions we do don't lead anywhere and the third-party cookies actually disappear. So let's just consider that this might be a possible outcome. It's not like the OpenID Connect group is powerless. There are solutions today that don't rely on cookies for sign out, for example, but the way in which the standard is being described proved not to be particularly effective in terms of the ability to deploy that particular scenario. But that doesn't mean that it's the only way. So we had discussions with David Wade, for example, on the fact that there are other approaches which might be predicated on token revocation, which can be used to approximate a sign out. And so I think that it would be useful, at least to consider the possibility that some of these talks will not lead to where we hope we will get, and then provide some alternatives so that for people that, for example, cannot wait, maybe say that we negotiate a good solution, but it will take a while for that solution to solidify. So exploring some of those things, I believe might be useful. But then again, everyone has a different position on this. So I just wanted to—
I will say, if people want to do something today, they can implement the back channel logout as it exists. I recognize that the internal structure of your app probably gets messed up by that, depending upon how you've architected it, because you're going to have an internal mechanism to communicate from the back channel to the front channel about session revocation or what have you. But if the OPs start supporting that today, we could be in a place that when third-party cookies go away, at least logout works that way.
So that's the part that I'm challenging. When you say can, I don't think that's true for many people. Let's say that in order for having a relying party that implements the back channel as it is designed today, you need actually to be stateful. You need to wait for the time in which your user agent actually comes back and hit you, and you need to have you need to maintain this list of. So from the point of view of actually implementing the relying party, we know that a lot of relying parties would have a very, very hard time to actually implement the spec as it exists today, which to me in practice means they cannot do it. And if there are ways in which we can achieve the same effect without asking people to significantly re-architect the relying party, then I think that it would be useful. Just telling them, here, there is the letter of the law, you better follow it, and then how you actually do it is exercised to the reader, I think it would be a pretty unproductive way of helping the community. So all I'm saying is that perhaps before we could afford to have this thing not to be implemented by many people because we had much cheaper, much more viable alternatives. Now that those alternatives potentially go away, I think it might be time to reconsider these back channel scenarios and see if there are any ways in which we can make them more friendly to the current deployments.
I completely agree. We need to look under the covers and give people concrete, usable guidance. And I think that's a productive thing to go on in the Connect working group with yourself and others that have systems that are real.
Sam, did you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to plus one what Vittorio said. I think it's perfectly reasonable to look at as many alternatives as possible. If you are able to find ways out of logout without browser changes, then that's good. I just wanted to give you the ability to. I just wanted to offer some transparency over how Chrome developers web platform features. I've linked the process in the chat, but it should give you like a sense of how, like at what stage I am at with OID, and like what is the next step for me, and what kind of like artifacts I produce in each of these steps. And so, it's all done publicly and transparently over a main list called Blink Dev. There's an intent to prototype phase, an intent to experiment phase, and an intent to ship phase. These are all like well-defined phases, with each of the phases with like well-defined artifacts that needs to be produced, including evidence that from the ecosystem whether things work or not. Where we're at is the phase between intent to prototype and intent to experiment, which is when we prototype in preparation for a larger experimentation in Chrome. And so that's where we are, and that's how these features are developed through that process. So just wanted to give you like a sense. Some of you may not be browser engineers, and so just wanted to be transparent about how those things, how the sausage gets made, I guess.
Thanks, Sam.
And Sam, can you just clarify for the group what you mean by the feature here? Like in that you're saying WebID, correct?
WebID specifically, but just across the board, all of the Chrome features, including the ones that are offering alternatives to third-party cookies, as well as blocking third-party cookies. All these things are transparently and publicly announced in the Blink Dev main list. So not just for WebID, where we fit within this process, but it's every single web platform feature goes through this process. So you could observe not only WebID, not only observe but participate, not only WebID, but also any other web platform feature that Chrome is working on.
Thanks. So we are approaching the top of the hour, and I guess we should close our Q&A session. So thanks very much for the participation. And I'd first like to thank all the speakers for taking part in this workshop. And then I'd also like to thank Mike Less for organizing this workshop for smooth, operation of it. Without you, it wouldn't happen like this. And then I'd like to thank all the participants for making comments and listening into and give considerations, the contemplations on the technology that we are building. Don, did you want to say something?
No, I'm good.
I'll say one thing. I wanted to, again, welcome Gail to the foundation. And thanks to the search committee who talked to a number of really great people in the identity space. And we're really happy with the future that we have ahead of us. And I encourage all of you to try to get to know Gail, probably not all at once, and look forward to what we have ahead of us.
Thank you, Mike. Looking forward to talking to everyone, one-to-one and in groups, as you say. Feel free to.
All right. So thank you very much, everyone. It's a great 3 hours for me. It's 4 a.m. here, but it was totally worth attending it. So let's see you in the next workshop, if not before. All right. Thanks very much.
See you.
Yep. Bye.